In this session, we are going to discuss the OpenShift security related topic, how OpenShift impose security in Kubernetes. By default, in Kubernetes, these are, we can say, some weaknesses. If we are not implementing those securities by force, so it will not be available in the Kubernetes. But OpenShift make these settings by default in the cluster. So today we have to understand the concept of SCC security context constraint. The context constraint we discuss in Kubernetes deep dive session, where we can enforce the user to deploy the resources with some specific security settings. So now we have to uh, check. First of all, I will check what user I am using. Kubeadmin, OC API resources. So security context constraints, SCC, and it's a cluster level of resource. And this SCC is the custom resource created by OpenShift. This is not by default available in Kubernetes. So how this SCC will affect when we are deploying any application. So to look this, to get the idea what is this resource, first of all I will show you some application deployment scenario, the issues we will face, and then we will fix it, and then we will correlate how SCC is affecting the application deployment. So if I look into OC-cat SCC, you can see there are multiple resources created by default by OpenShift, anyuid, host access, host bound anyuid. So these all resources are by default available. We can create more. But before understanding this, we have to create some scenario. So let me log in with my dev1 user, and its namespace is by default selected dev. Okay. Let me check OC-cat. Any resources running? No. OC new app. I can say the name of the app is app1 image nginx. So I'm trying to run a new application here with name app1 by using nginx image. And you know, nginx is the default image I am going to pull from Docker Hub, and it is running as a root user inside this container. So here the application is deployed, OC-cat pod. You can see it is crashed. What is the reason? So let me check OC logs, this pod. So here we can see in the logs what happened. Var cache nginx client temp failed permission denied. Var cache nginx client temp failed permission denied, because this image that I use is designed to use as a root user, and you know root user has full access. Now OpenShift enforce this pod, this container, to run as non-root user. That makes that non-root user, when that non-root user try to run the nginx service, this path was not reachable initially by this the user that was enforced by OpenShift inside this container. Now let's deploy another application that will use uh, another nginx image, but this nginx image is designed to be runable as a non-root user. We used this image previously in some exercises, in Kubernetes exercises in security section. So now let's see your OC-cat pod. You can see this is running. Now what happened if I look into the OC RSH this pod and just check the ID, which user is responsible to run this container. So OpenShift enforced this very random ID, a non-root user ID, to be responsible to run the nginx service inside this container. And this image that I used was designed to be runnable by any non-root user. But the previous image what I used nginx was designed to only run by root user. So that's why this random ID user, whatever this user is, was able to run the nginx service and it's running perfectly fine. So now who is responsible actually to uh, to decide the non-root user? So this to understand this, we need to understand a command OC Adam policy. In OC Adam policy, there is scc subject review. So scc subject review will give us the idea about any manifest uh, that what security context constraint was used in this deployment. For example, OC get pod. I have this pod. OC get pod. This pod that gave me the error -o yaml. This is the complete manifest. So what I can do, I will use this as an input for OC Adam policy subject review. I want to do a subject review -f and hyphen. So actually this last hyphen will be something like a variable that will take the input of this first whole command. Or either you can directly use this command with some manifest file directly. But if you want to inspect some running application, running pod manifest, running deployment manifest, you can use this command. So here, since we are using the dev1 user and dev1 user don't have this advanced level of privileges to execute this command to see this scc subject review. So we must have to log in with the kube admin user. Kube admin user also logged in with the dev in the dev resource OC get pods. So same pods there are. So now I will run the same command again, and here it is saying that this pod was used with scc restricted v2, and when I listed OC get scc, I showed you this was also a resource created by OpenShift cluster in the domain of scc resource. So now if I show you OC get pod, this another pod, same command I will recall with a different pod. So here this is also using restricted v2. So this restricted v2 scc actually enforced these two pods to use a non-root user inside their containers. Okay, how this is, we will understand this. Now, if I look into this, the same command, and if I do a grep to service account, so you can see the service account is default. So you know the story of service account we discussed in very detail in Kubernetes. Uh, every pod is using some service account, and if you are not defining in the manifest of the deployment or whatever pod you are going to deploy, by default a default service account is available in all namespaces that will be used to run that pod. So what is the story behind this default service account is associated with this scc. Now the question is how. So we will see this in this scenario we created. So we understand the idea that what is happening, what is the issue happening behind this whole deployment. One more thing I would like to show you, OC status, what is OC status command we use, and we can also use OC status suggest for all the new app we deployed, and it will give you the recommendation, the best practices required to be applicable on these apps. And if there is some error in the application deployment, it will also suggest you what remedies you can do to fix these issues. So here you can see the constraint is starting, and repeatedly it is restarting and trying to restart. You can see the logs with this command, and here current security policy prevent your container from being run as a root user. So OpenShift is preventing to run this container as a root user. It is suggesting to run this command to make this issue fixed. So what this command will do? This command OC add-on policy add security context to user, this security context in this namespace to this service account. So I showed you the service account is default in this pod. So it is suggesting you to use this service account with this SCC. It's mean there is a relationship in between the service account and security context constraint. So that will actually decide the actual policy that has to be inside our application, inside our pod and container. So I will, the default service account, you can use this, but this can be a security risk. If you allow this default service account with any UID, security SCC, so all the application will in future, whatever in which you have not defined your service account will use this default service account, and that will be security threat. So it is recommended to not use this default service account and create your own service account and use those service accounts inside your application. So let me show you OC get service account. So you can see this default service account is there, and this service account I think I created for some reason, so you will not see this by default, but here this service account is in use. So let me OC delete this service account, and so now OC get pods. So we have OC get deployment. We have two deployments, and this is app one that is getting the issue. So what I will do, I will create OC, create service account. I can say SA app1. This service account I have created for SA app1, and this service account is now created. Now I will associate this service account with the security context that will allow the pod to be runnable with the root user privileges. So OC get SCC, I showed you there is any UID. So this any UID SCC will allow the pod to use any UID, whatever is by default used by building that image, while creating the Docker file, and they use that specific user. And so OpenShift will not deny that user to run inside that pod, and it will not enforce the non-root user. Uh, Remember, using this NUUID is the weakest, we can say, security context constraint, and this is not recommended to use this. Okay, so but just to understand this, we are implementing it here. So now what I will do, OC add-on policy. So if you are not aware about the syntax, don't worry. Just remember OC add-on policy. Press enter, and here you can see uh, add security context constraint to user. Okay, and the user can be the human user or a service account. The machine user and the human user both are manageable by this command. And you can also create for this group. But group is only for, seems like for the humans, but you will always use add-scc to user for the service accounts. Now, here, what service SCC we want to use? We are using any UUID and the user. If you are attaching a human user, then you will define straightforward the username. But if you are using a system user, that is service account, then you will use -z and then the service account as a, I think app1 I created, service account app1. OC get service account SAF1. Yes, I created. Now, if you look the output of this command, just focus this. Cluster role-based access authorization, system OpenShift SCC any UID added this service account. So in fact, this OC add-on policy, this command just created a cluster role binding and that associate this service account with some cluster role. If we are running a very simple Kubernetes cluster, not the OpenShift, then we will use OC create cluster role binding, you know that command very well. So let me show you OC cat role bindings. So yeah, it's a cluster level. So cluster role bindings, cluster role bindings, and there are a lot of cluster role bindings, so I will grab this cluster role binding uh, added, sorry, cluster role binding name is something like this. Yeah, so here you can see the system OpenShift SCC NEU UUID is added. Let me just reduce the font size. It is added, and yeah, there is already a machine OS builder and a UUID. Yes, it was also mentioned here, but uh, this special uh, cluster role binding is created, and if I OC describe this cluster role bindings with this name, this is a system level of role binding. So here you can see in the dev namespace, this service account is associated with a cluster role that name is service OpenShift SCC NEUID. Okay, so when we are using kubectl create cluster role binding, we are defining the name. But when we are using OC add-on policy command, it will also create the cluster role binding, but the name it will use as it is whatever the cluster role is. Okay, so the name we cannot define in this command directly, it will automatically decide. So now we have to investigate OC describe cluster role, this cluster role that is associated with service account. What this cluster role will do the magic on this service account. So now here you can see this cluster role is basically working with security context constraints, resource, and the resource name any UUID to use. Okay, so and if you are confused with the cluster role, just look into my videos of Kubernetes deep dive, where I explain you in detail the RBAC, where we discuss in detail about the roles, cluster role binding, cluster role binding, human users, system machine users, very detailed. So then you will get the idea what is this whole story written here. So in fact, this is not a difficult job. OC API resources, and if I grab SCC, you can see this is a cluster resource. Okay, and it's you can see security.openshift v1. Okay, this group. This whole resource name is mentioned here. And under OC get SCC, there is a resource I showed you, anyuid is allowed to use. By which user? This user. Now this user is associated with this group, this role, and this role has this anyuid to use as a resource. So now it's time to look into this it's time to look into this resource, what this resource actually definition has. So let me OC describe SCC anyuid, what has been written inside this security context constraint resource created. So this is the definition that system admins users, all the cluster admins will be by default able to use this SCC. That's why whenever I am running a pod with any root user by a cluster admin, kube admin user, they are able to run the pod. But all the users, those who are not member of this group, they cannot run. They will use some default SCC. So these are all the privilege escalation we discuss in Kubernetes security deep dive. So these are the settings will be enforced on the manifest of the pod to set the security context related setting. What user UUID you can use, and if I show you the restricted one, describe SCC restricted v2. So here you can see allow privilege escalation is false, and then here you can see uh, root file system, and here allow capabilities, volume type. So because of this privilege escalation false, the non-root user is enforced in the non-root user is enforced in the or manifest of the created pod. So now this OC get service account is configured to use any UUID. But OC get pod, OC get deployment are still having this problem. So now it's time to change in this deployment the service account from default to this new service account. So let me now, I think the system admin role is done, whatever system admin has to do. Now system admin will tell this tab one user to log in. Now just change the service account inside your deployment and it will be running then. So OC set service account is a command. Let me show you OC set command. OC set, and we can set all these things in the running pod and deployment at the runtime. So I am interested in the service account. So either I can type complete service account as SA, then hyphen hyphen help, and there are some example deployment. What is the deployment name and the service account name? Very simple. So OC get service account and OC set service account in deployment. OC get deployment. Okay. OC set service account in the deployment. This deployment is not running with the service account, this one, and hyphen n dev is not mandatory because right now I am in that specific namespace already. So this deployment is updated with this new service account instead of default. The patch you can say is applied and this is updated. Now OC get pod, so it will be able to run in a while. After some time it will retry and it will run. So now I will show you OC OC Adam policy and scc subject review hyphen f hyphen and OC get pod OC get pod this error pod and hyphen OYML and then we have to OC Adam policy. I want to check I must have to log in now kubeadmin to check this. So it is still using restricted v2. So I think the kubeadmin user can only do this job, set this service account. Deployment f1 should be able to use SA f1. Just let me validate this again. Here we have to make sure, let me check what mistake I did. Service account in the namespace, set service account, deployment service account in the project name. Everything is good. I think I need to OC delete this pod. OC get pod. Still it is getting the error. Now let me check with the new pod. It is still using the restricted v2. OC get. Okay, so right now I can see this pod is crashing. So let me check OC get pod hyphen o yml. Just grab the scc. You can directly grab the scc too, and you can use the other command OC Adam policy. So another thing I want to check, the service account is right now set to default. So OC get service account. We created this. We associate the new SCC with this. So OC set service account. Let me do this again. Deployment app1 and the service account is SA app1 in dev namespace. It's not mandatory to define the dev, but because we are using the default namespace dev. So it is updated. Now let me just check OC get pod. It is not running still. It's getting error. So here, let me check the service. It is still using the old and scc, it is still using the code because service account is not updated. But here if I do the OCCAT deployment app1 service account, so you can see in the deployment it is updated, but in the pod it is not. So what I will do, OCCAT pod OC scale deployment app1 replicas to 0, and OCCAT pod, you can see the pod is deleted and now again set to replica to 1, OCCAT pod, and now it is running. So now if I do OCCAT pod, this pod name in hyphen OYML and pipe sign grep scc, you can see the scc is updated to anyuid. And if I search for service, the service account is also updated in the pod level. So uh, it will take some time, maybe automatically, to update in the pod, and or you need to delete existing pod or scale down and scale up. It will apply again, reapply from the deployment. So now what happened, the service account is updated, and this service account is associated with a cluster role binding. That cluster role binding hold a cluster role. That cluster role is pointing to special, that service account is uh, associated with that scc. So this is the whole chain. If I write down here the whole scenario, so what happened, the account service account service account uh, is pointing to the deployment. Inside the deployment, in fact this deployment is using the service account. Deployment is using service account, and then service account is associated with the cluster role binding, and cluster role binding uh, is associated with cluster role, uh, and cluster role binding is basically a combination of I should not here put an arrow, it is, I can say something like this: cluster role plus service account. Okay, and this is this cluster role and service account, this cluster role is pointing to uh, the cluster role is pointing to the scc uh, with some verb that we observe in the when we did the get. So OCCAT cluster role binding uh, grep UUID anyuid. Sorry, I'm not cube admin user, so I must have to be login with the cube admin user, and this service account describe cluster role binding, this one, and it is pointing to this cluster role. And if I do a describe cluster role, just to show you how this whole chain is connected. So it is the verb is used, mean uh, this scc is usable by this user. Okay, so I will scc. Uh, so this is the whole chain. The deployment pointing to service account and the cluster role binding combination of cluster role and service account, and this cluster role is pointing to this special SCC, whatever SCC could be. So this was the whole concept. So now the final thing we have to understand. One OC get pod. Let me show you one thing again. That OC RSH, this new pod created with the ID, you can see it is using 0 ID. So this is granted by OpenShift SCC. But the other pod is not using the same ID because OpenShift enforced the non-root user ID. Okay, so now the final thing, OC get SCC. So what are now these SCCs? Who created this? So OpenShift created this, and this whole definition is given in this SCC here. But if you do OC get SCC anyuid hyphen OYML, so you will get the better idea. What is the scope of work of this SCC? It's better to do describe this SCC. It will be more meaningful. So here you can see this SCC, and this is some priority. This cluster admins user by default can use these and allow privilege escalation. Mean the advanced level of privilege escalation is allowed, set to true. So allow capabilities and a volume, what type of volume it can use, config map, CSI, empty directory, but not the host path. Not the host path is usable by this SCC is not allowed in this SCC. So so this is the whole configuration. And now if I show you one more thing, the host, there is host access SCC. Describe this host access SCC. So here you can see the volume host path is also allowed in this one. And the privilege escalation, it's mean this one has more privileges than this NUID. It is only connected. It will only solve the GNUID. SCC will only solve the issues related to UID. So the solution is not to switch to SCC, but the solution is to rebuild your image with the proper non-root user that is recommended by OpenShift. So, but still there are some situations when we cannot build our own image. Just like we are going to deploy some Helm chart, we are going to deploy some controller. So those customizations are very difficult. Just like we did, we did the deployment, OC projects, uh, storage. I think we use NFS. Yeah, NFS storage class we created. So OC get all in this namespace. So we created this pod, and at that time I have not explained you. OC get this pod and sorry, OC RSH uh, RSH this pod in this namespace. Just look the ID. Not found. Storage class. this pod. Okay, I don't know why this is not doing, but the ID inside this pod is running as just do bash. Let me try to do. Actually, this I think this pod is protected for something, but I want to show you the actual user inside this NFS storage class is used as root. And you remember we did the session on storage class, and we at that time used the anyuid scc for a service account that was used in this pod. Okay, so this is this is the situation we fixed with the scc. So this is the case where you cannot rebuild the image because those are built by the vendors. So whatever, but the best practice is whatever you are running on as an application, you are building your own images. So you must have to use a non-root user instead of using root user to comply the OpenShift security parameters. Okay, so now we will go back to SCC, and I will now describe the another SCC that was by default used restricted v2. In older version of OpenShift, there was only restricted, but now they introduced the restricted v2. But this restricted v2 is doing some advanced level of enforcement, security enforcement it will apply. I mean, you cannot switch to admin user inside the pod. Privilege escalation false. Host mount is false. Okay, so all these securities are enforced in this one. And if I do the restricted one, I think there is a minor difference in this restricted one and this this restricted v2. Okay, so you have to decide according to your environment what type of SCCs you can use, or you can take the advice from OpenShift by if you are using OC new app command to deploy your application, and that will help you to understand what the issue is.